Welcome to the destruction of the 3 World Trade Center towers in New York City on September 11th, 2001, and a whole lot more. This is 9/11 Free Fall. Hello everyone, I'm Andy Steele, here again for another episode, and this one is going to be unique and something I think hasn't been explored much within the movement or on many 9/11 truth sites. We're going to be joined by Counselor Dorothy Lorig, and we're going to be talking a little bit about the Twilight Zone society we live in that runs from the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence like we've done in the past, but we're also largely going to be discussing you. And by you, I mean the choir, the people out there awake to the evidence, unafraid of it. We're going to discuss how to cope with the situation we're in and deal with the day-to-day life of living in a society run by mass peer pressure and a system designed to demonize you and isolate you for knowing the truth. I think an episode like this is long overdue, and I sense that some of the questions that I'll be asking of our guests today are questions a lot of you out there may have asked yourselves or been struggling with ever since you woke up to the crime of the century. Now, if you're listening to this in the archive, spread this episode around to others in your 9/11 truth circles, and I hope it starts more discussion on some of these issues. And even though the media tries to paint you in a negative light as this kind of two-dimensional person who only cares about 9/11, you are a human being, and the situation that we're in of being aware of what really happened in New York does impact basic aspects of everyday life that all humans have to deal with. By that I mean work, relationships, parenting, overall enjoyment of your day. Now, knowing the controlled demolition of the buildings in New York on 9/11 is stressful, to say the least. Hopefully, by addressing some of these things openly today, we can slightly lessen that burden on you and let you know that you're not alone with these issues. Now, if this is the first episode of this show you ever came across and you have no idea what I'm talking about, the show is 9/11 Free Fall, and we talk about 9/11 truth with a focus on the science that disproves the government's official story for why the buildings in New York came down. And I bring you guests who are out there trying to wake you up to the facts. All right, the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7 were brought down in a pre-planned controlled demolition on 9/11, and high-up members of your government and your favorite TV and newspaper media source either don't want to face this fact or are actively covering it up. Okay, folks, 2 plus 2 does not equal 5 just because the government says so, or because some talking head disparages you for saying it equals 4. There's certain laws of physics and common sense that remain intact even on 9/11, and even though the world changed that day, science didn't. If you go to the archive of this show at 911freefall.com, you'll hear my interviews with respected members of the scientific community who have disproved the government's official story and who have concluded that the buildings in New York had to have been brought down with explosives. Okay, I've talked to those who have found the explosive residue in the Trade Center dust. The evidence is overwhelming, but because of certain political and social obstacles, justice is slow in coming. This show is part of changing that, and you out there are the spark that's going to spread the word and change the world with your voice. Now, the group at the forefront of exposing this evidence is, of course, architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. Since 2007, this organization has been working hard to gather the evidence and present it wherever it can. All right, the movies you need to watch are Blueprint for Truth and 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out. There you will see the evidence that I'm talking about and hear the testimonies of several scientific experts who will tell you why this controversy is real and who lend their support to a call for a real investigation into the destruction of the Twin Towers and Building 7. And once you're awake and you realize the seriousness of the situation and want to spread the word, you just sign the petition and then click the volunteer tab on the right-hand side of the screen and let AE 9/11 Truth know that you want to help. All right, whoever you are, you have a talent that's needed in this fight. I say it every week. All right, you make a difference just by trying and joining the team, and lending your brain to this battle is one of the best ways to support the real war effort. And this is not a war of violence, but it's a war of words and thought. We are the ones we've been waiting for, folks. You can't rely on those already empowered to do the work for you because they won't. It's up to us, all of us, to expose the lie and make the world a better place, for not just for us, but for our children as well. That's AE911truth.org. Go there right now. Okay, some quick 9/11 related news. We have the newest installment of Adam Taylor's series, Debunking the Real 9/11 Myths, Why Popular Mechanics Can't Face Up to Reality. In this latest one, this is part 10, he looks at the quick removal of debris from the World Trade Center site and Popular Mechanics' dismissal of it as hampering a real investigation. And I'm not going to go over the whole thing here, but I'll just read a quick excerpt for you. It says in the article, much of the steel that NIST did have was left uncatalogued and stored in Hangar 17 at JFK Airport. NIST used fallacious reasoning to exclude most of the steel from its primary investigation. Rather than acknowledge the absurdity of this, Popular Mechanics instead notes that NIST relied extensively on computer models to investigate Building 7's collapse. The writers also quote New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg, who they also mention as having an engineering degree, as saying just looking at a piece of metal generally doesn't tell you anything. However, examining a piece of metal can actually tell you quite a lot. In fact, one piece of steel from WTC-7 was remarkably informative. Two professors from Worcester Polytechnic Institute found that it had been corroded and melted by a liquid eutectic mixture of primarily iron, oxygen, and sulfur, which, interestingly enough, are also the primary components of thermite, an incendiary used in military applications to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. However, this phenomenon was reported nowhere in NIST's final report on WTC-7, even though NIST was obviously aware of it. Popular Mechanics also omits this fact, which is odd considering that its goal was to disprove the most prominent conspiracy claims. So the whole article is up there at ae911truth.org. You can read it for yourself. We also have this breaking from the Debunking the Debunkers blog. It has a story up titled New Evidence from AE911 Truth Chemical Engineer Mark Basile, Ignition of Red Gray Chips versus 3 different paint chips. And in this, Mark Basile, you see there's a video there. He's tested samples of paint and found that neither the blue nor red paint chips from the World Trade Center exhibit any of the thermitic properties that the active red-gray chips in the thermite paper demonstrate. All right, no tested paint chips have ignited and produced molten iron spheres. And I'm working on getting Mark and John Michael Talbot, he's the author of the article, up there at that blog, who wrote about this, working on getting them here on the show. So keep watching out for that in the next few weeks. We're going to have them go into that in a little more detail when they do. Now, in other news, the American Muslim Political Action Committee is planning a Million Muslim March this year in D.C. on the September 11th anniversary, and they say it's to fight back against the slanderous and libel statements made against Muslims after 9/11 by the media, the attacks on Muslim countries, and attacks on the rights of Muslims, really everybody though, with legislation like the NDAA by the U.S. government. And this group doesn't question the official story of 9/11. I'm mentioning it only because neocon groups and publications are in a big uproar about this planned march, and this has the potential of being the big hype story that the media makes a big deal of around the 9/11 this year, around the anniversary time. And I'm not saying that the media definitely will make a big deal out of it, but this is the kind of thing that serves to be divisive enough to keep everyone at each other's throats and reinforce that 9/12 feeling Glenn Beck and his ilk wants everyone to live in perpetually, even 11 years after the event here. So, of course, the real news shouldn't be that Muslims demand the same constitutional protections everyone has, but the fact that now almost 2,000 architects and engineers are questioning the official story of how the buildings came down. Of course, the media would rather distract you with divisive stuff that reinforces the official story than have people examine the event in any real depth. So keep an eye out for this story, but ignore it when it happens. It's not the real issue. The real issue is the truth of what happened on that day. Okay, before we get to our guests, we're going to do what we do every week. We're going to take about 10 seconds of silence to remember the victims of 9/11 and their families and everybody who has died in the wars that followed 9/11. So we're going to do that right now. And that is 10 seconds. Okay, our guest today is Dorothy Lorig. Dorothy has been a member of Colorado 9/11 Visibility since 2006, which she joined shortly after encountering compelling evidence that the government's explanation of 9/11 could not be true. Dorothy is a former high school science teacher. She holds a master's degree in counseling and psychology from the University of Colorado and is the mother of 2 grown children. She co-owns and operates a Denver area warehouse business that distributes bulk organic foods and is launching a private practice as a psychotherapist. She's been an activist since high school and on many progressive fronts, and believes that coming to terms with the implications of the 9/11 evidence is essential to building an effective peace movement in the United States and around the world. Dorothy, welcome to 9/11 Freefall.
Thank you, Andy. It's good to be here.
Now, since this is your first appearance on this show, please tell us about your own realization of the evidence of what really happened on 9/11 and what prompted you to start speaking out about it.
Oh, boy. Maybe I'll start first with the day of 9/11 itself, which was a very strange day. I don't normally listen to the radio. I'm not a radio kind of person. I read books mostly. But on the morning of 9/11, for some reason I still don't understand, I turned on the radio as soon as I woke up, just in time to hear that a plane had flown into the North Tower. And at that point, they were still thinking it was some sort of accident. And I ran out of the bedroom and into the living room to turn on the TV just in time to see the plane go into the second tower. And of course, at that point, it became obvious that it was some sort of planned event. So it was a very surreal start to a day, and I don't listen to radio normally. Didn't before that day and didn't since that day. But there was something a little odd in the atmosphere, I guess, on the day of 9/11. So fast forward to March of 2004, it was the first anniversary of our invasion of Iraq, and my children and I were participating in a march at the state capitol in Denver with my older brother to protest the invasion and war. And afterwards, my brother sort of casually mentioned to me that some people, he put it that way, some people thought that 9/11 may not have been carried out by any outside group, but that the government may have been responsible. And my reaction when he said that was just a feeling of revulsion, like he had exposed himself to me. It was just a really, yuck kind of feeling, and I really admire and respect my older brother, and I didn't want to get into any kind of confrontation with him, so I don't know exactly what I did, but I shut down the conversation. I must have changed the subject or something, because we just didn't go there. But of course I remembered what he had said. And then later on, a year or two later, I'm not sure exactly when, Michael Moore's movie Fahrenheit 9/11 came out, and he didn't address anything about the idea that 9/11 might be an inside job, but he did make it really clear that there were some powerful interests being served within our own government, powerful financial interests among others, being served by 9/11. And Bush family connections with the Saudis and so on. And so that, I guess you could say, that kind of softened me up to be able to potentially take another look at it at some point. So then in May 2006, my husband, who he's an airplane aficionado, I suppose. He likes to study anything to do with airliners. And so, unbeknownst to me, he had been quietly studying the whole thing around 9/11 for some time, including he had to go to Washington, D.C. on a business trip, and while there, he managed to go by the Pentagon and look for himself, about where the plane had come in, the angle it had come in, and how it had gone into the Pentagon allegedly, and so on, because he was trying to sort of put it all together for himself. And a little bit, and he didn't tell me about this. He was just, he must have known that I was pretty closed to any information like that. And however, he did know how to get to me. A little while later, he found a sort of progressive left-wing journal called Left Curve. I think it's published in Oakland. He found it at Barnes & Noble, and it had a review in it of a couple books by Professor David Ray Griffin, who's written extensively on the information around 9/11. And my husband just sort of casually said to me, "Oh, you might find this interesting." He was very smart. He didn't say anything beyond that. So nothing to raise my defenses. And I read the article, and it shifted something for me to where I knew I had to look at it more. And a day or two later, I was in my office at the warehouse where I work, and read an article by David Ray Griffin saying, basically laying out the case that the government made about 9/11 and why it could not be true. And he gave a lot of very specific examples, points of evidence. Everything was highly footnoted, well-researched. And by the end of reading that particular article, which was online, I couldn't stand being in my office anymore. I really felt like I might throw up and just ran out. Fortunately, I'm one of the owners of the business, so I don't have to punch out on a time clock or anything, but I exited the building and went on a long walk just because I basically needed to fall apart for a little bit. And I did, and I cried very hard and felt like everything. Well, there's a Weird Al Yankovic song from way back saying something like, everything you know is wrong. And that's how it felt, that everything I thought I could count on was suddenly gone, that there was no foundation under me, and that I had to reassess everything. And so huge amounts of grief and fear came up. Then later, a lot of anger came up. But at that time, it was just sort of grief and fear and feeling like all of a sudden I had a new purpose in my life, which I had certainly not anticipated, which was that I have to look at this in a whole lot more depth, and I have to start letting people know what I have found out.
That's amazing that you described that. And, I've said it before in the show. I'll tell you, when this whole era of history was going on, 9/11 and the build-up to the wars, I actually leaned conservative, and I supported Bush. I wasn't one of these people that said, let's go out and get the Muslims and kill them, or made a big excited argument for a war, but I just kind of gave them the benefit of the doubt. But I had liberal friends who were against the war and getting on me about that. But when I first came across this evidence, and I'm not the type of person who looks away from something that's true, even if it affects his worldview. I present this to those friends. They would jump down my throat, and it really surprised me. And it just really kind of illustrates the situation that we're in right now that continues to affect our current progress here. And, I was able to kind of reorient, but I learned to shut my mouth for at least a few months until I could reevaluate the situation, and you do have to change your worldview, and you do have to accept things that are unpleasant. And I understand that feeling that you had. It was kind of a slow process for me because I tried to debunk it, but I couldn't. And it's just funny, you coming from the left and protesting the war, but at the same time you were resistant to this information. I think that's a fascinating phenomenon.
Yeah, and I think it wasn't until later, reflecting back, that I was able to understand that even though I had sort of distrusted our government for a very long time. I mean, if you're involved in progressive causes, that you're going to have a lot of basis for doing so. But there was some place in me that thought, okay, the government does bad things, but it's not wholly evil. It wouldn't do that level of evil. And to come to terms with that was very, very difficult. I think I really liked feeling like I was part of a country that would only go so far, that had a certain level of ethics that it would try to maintain. And it was definitely not fun, realizing that basically there's no low to which our government would not stoop.
Right. Now, I always talk on the show about the situation we find ourselves in. And so you and the audience know where I'm coming from. I describe that situation as I see it being one in which Americans are facing something for which there is really no historical precedent to draw from. I'm not saying that false flag events have never happened, but where it's so obvious and there's means for people to talk and expose it. And it's so big, people don't want to face it. Evidence like Building 7's impossible destruction is like spotting your spouse from a distance out in the park holding hands and getting cozy with another person. Except I think it's bigger than that. I would say it's like finding out your spouse might be a serial killer. So many people have so much invested in this society, they don't want to rock the boat. They just turn around and back protect the establishment, even if deep down they know the truth, or they say they don't want any part of it, and they go about their day, and they leave the people who can't live with the lie alone to figure out how to fix this. That's how I see it. Now, with that said, how do you yourself see the situation in America with this mass silence of this issue right now in the wake of 9/11 and 9/11 truth?
Well, I guess, it's interesting that you use the spouse metaphor, which is appropriate. I tended to use the parent metaphor because I think most of us have grown up, being forced to recite the Pledge of Allegiance every morning in school and so on. We have internalized the government as sort of another parent figure, as sort of the ultimate authority figure. I'm not religious, so maybe other people say God, but barring that, most of us have the United States government way up there too as some sort of ultimate authority figure. So I think, for me, like I said, for me it was a very visceral response having to look at this information. It hit me in my stomach, that sense of revulsion and disgust, which if I had ever found out, for instance, that one of my parents was a child molester, I can imagine that same sort of sense of revulsion and disgust. And fortunately, neither of my parents is a child molester. I haven't had to deal with that. But, in my training as a psychotherapist, you come across a lot of stories about people who are molested by parents when they're growing up, and when they try to talk about it, they are routinely shamed and silenced by other members of the family, other siblings, and maybe the non-molesting parent, and so on. And so the person who has been molested becomes the bad person, the messenger. Everybody shoots the messenger. The messenger becomes the disgusting person, and the molester gets left alone and doesn't get talked about.
Right. I think that's actually an even better metaphor that you just gave. And, we talk about certain things in this country. We will talk about certain wedge issues, or we'll acknowledge that the president might not be a good speaker, that he's, kind of a warmonger. And we'll acknowledge some basic surface corruption like the cronyism and the opportunism after the war, and I equate that to the family talking about dad's drinking problem and laughing about how he's stumbling around at family reunions and things like that, but they won't talk about how he's molesting the kids at night. That's one step too far. That's taboo. I think that's a really good comparison that you just made there. Now, there are when you use that comparison, you look at the kid who's being abused here, and I guess that would be the members of the well, really it's every American, but the one who's trying to speak out and being demonized, that is the people like us, the activists out there trying to sound the alarm. So let's talk about day-to-day life. And I hear people say things like they don't want to put this information in their mind because it's too much for them. And I understand that to an extent. There's things I learned about, not just with 9/11, but other topics too that I wish I hadn't learned about, to be honest. But I'm not the type of person who can just look away, and neither are the listeners of the show. So for those out there struggling with this, how does somebody know about the 9/11 reality and fight to expose it, but at the same time mingle with those folks out there who don't chit-chat about anything other than these cultural distractions or their anecdotes about work, and who are, how do you not simply withdraw from society because that society has lost touch with what's important?
Well, I don't like to disconnect from people. Certainly, becoming a 9/11 truth activist has been hard on certain of my relationships, including in my own family. Now, my husband and my children are fully on board, so that's been great, and so have my brothers. So have been my brothers. But parents, sister, other friends, and so on, not so much. And so, I think all of us learn to compartmentalize to a certain extent. It's a matter of getting through the day, matter of getting through whatever social interactions you have to manage without becoming isolated. So that was May of 2006 when I had that huge epiphany, that all was not as it had seemed and realized that I needed to take action. It took a few more months after that before I met the people in Colorado 9/11 Truth, or 9/11 Visibility, and joined with them. And that became my support group. And after that, I started to feel sane again, to be honest. I spent a very long summer after reading everything I could find from the library and online, and having nightmares, having trouble getting to sleep, feeling constantly paranoid that people from the government were going to hunt me down and kill me. I mean, when you're by yourself, your imagination runs rampant. It just goes wild. There's no limits on it. When you're with a group of other people who've had to grapple with the same information, you can settle down. You can realize, hey, statistically, my chances of surviving being a 9/11 Truth activist are actually pretty good, and you start to feel like yourself again.
Yeah, that's funny, and it's hard because it's almost like a mental isolation feeling, and it does help. Like you go to an event like the marches at Ground Zero every year, or just any kind of 9/11 event where they have a conference or speakers, and you get around like-minded people, and you feel charged. That maybe there's something spiritual going on there. I don't know, but you get charged by the energy there. But when you're out there in your everyday life, and it's not even people attacking you, because now I've found that when I talk about this, because I don't keep silent. If something comes up, if somebody brings up the terrorists, and hate us because of our freedom or some stuff like that, I'm very outspoken. I don't care. I don't worry about the nervous looks anymore. But it is mentally isolating when you hear someone marginalize it and say, oh, you're a conspiracy buff. I mean, like it's some kind of hobby or something. And it is isolating because it's like you hear these people just chit-chatting about really what stuff that's not even important and not even getting the facts right. And rather than lecturing the entire world, sometimes you do have to just kind of sit silent, but because you got to get along at your job and everything, it's a delicate balance. But I think that getting in touch with people, having, talking to people, I think this show has helped me actually just by talking to people every week who are like-minded and right there in the research, just helps fight that mental isolation because you're not alone. And it's almost like fraternities when you say some kind of code to another person and they repeat it back. They, you instantly have like a brotherhood with them. And, I'm not even talking about anything dark evil here. I'm just talking about like fraternities, clubs people are part of, and they can instantly communicate. You mentioned Building 7, and somebody says, yeah, I know about that, and 9/11 was an inside job. It's like you instantly have a connection with that person, regardless of what your political leanings are, race, gender, whatever. It's like you instantly have a connection, and so you have to look for those connections and cherish them.
You do. It's funny. I mean, I've always been very left-wing and very consistently left-wing, still am. One of the things that I've really kind of valued about the 9/11 Truth movement, though, is that it kind of breaks down those left-right barriers a little bit, and it joins people in a whole new way that I've ever experienced. It's really about people who have made in many cases, a very difficult psychological shift, and you're never the same after that. And so it is a sort of a sorority / fraternity for people who have taken the trouble to do that.
Right. And, here's the thing. I think anger is a normal reaction when you discover this, and I think it's a good thing to an extent that it motivates people and to speak out and fight back, but it can also, like anything, go too far. So how do you keep disdain for this big lie and for those who push the lie and for the general ignorance of people that keep the lie protected? How do you keep that disdain from turning into an overall resentment of the human race in general, as is what I see happen with some folks?
Well, I guess for me, I mean, and I've been through all the phases, which is the fear and the grief and the anger, where I imagine, there's a saying within the 9/11 Truth movement that all roads lead to Dick Cheney. That he seems to have been a very central figure in planning and implementing this. And so, because everybody knows what Dick Cheney looks like, I know what Dick Cheney looks like, it's easy for me to imagine him and how I would like to punish him. And so I've been through that phase of, imagining various, sort of horrible things to do to the guy. And I guess that was a few years ago because I'm not there anymore. I try to imagine these days, I try to put myself in the perpetrator's shoes. I try to imagine what their motivations may have been, what it would have taken me to get into that same place. And to a degree, I'm able to empathize with them, at least to a small degree, because living in this country, especially, I live in Colorado. We're a landlocked state. We don't get hurricanes or tsunamis. Living as close as I do to the mountains, we don't even get tornadoes. I live in a relatively safe place. I'm white. I'm middle class, on and on. As far as safety goes in this world, I'm pretty close to the top as far as having things kind of worked out. And I got to say, there's a part of me that's very, very grateful to that and appreciative of that and appreciative of all the conveniences I get because I'm able to drive my car when I want to and go wherever I want. I have no limits on my ability to speak out and organize with, assemble with other people and so on. And so I know that there's a role that the government plays, as evil as it is, in keeping this situation going for me, and I would be very reluctant to lose it. And so there's a part of me that, and this is a secret part of me that now is a secret shared probably by however many thousands of people are listening to this. There's a part of me, a not so nice part of me, that enjoys the fact that America is an empire and protects its citizens in the way that an empire can. And because, and I'm not proud of that little, dark side of myself, but it allows me to empathize a little bit with whoever those people were who actually figured this out and made it happen.
Well, it's interesting, and I look at some of these people too, and they have some major problems. You start researching who they are, and there is a side of you that almost feels like I don't know. I don't even want to say sympathetic because I want to see them in handcuffs and spending the rest of their lives in prison. But you kind of understand what could go wrong in their thinking to make them there. And in terms of the general public, there was a point at which when I started, basically when I knew this was, oh my God, this is the situation, where I would resent people that would put up some neocon arguments, let's go get them kind of attitudes, happy to have a war and attack Iran if it's possible. These kinds of people, with the eagles in their Facebook avatars and stuff. And I've noticed this about myself. Like when I was reading that story about the Million Muslim March planned in D.C., and there's these neocons leaving comments on that organization's webpage, basically attacking them for doing that and saying, oh, how disrespectful, and you attacked us first. And they've got their eagles, giving the middle finger, American eagles giving the middle finger avatars in their Facebooks, and just nationalistic BS that just, fills their entire pages, posting stories from Glenn Beck. A couple of years ago, I may have felt inclined to write this really nasty thing just to ruin their day. And now I just realize that it's not even worth it. You begin to realize where to pick your battles, and I almost feel sorry for these people, where I can understand why they viciously attack anybody that's talking about the scientific evidence in 9/11, because they've got so much invested in this story, just emotionally, that giving it up would really take a toll on their psyche. And so I understand it. I don't accept it, but I understand it better, and that kind of lessens the bane I feel for them.
Yeah, and I try to not take things personally. It's hard. when I've been handing out flyers on the 16th Street Mall in Denver, I've noticed that the people who treat me badly tend to not be the people of color, also tend to not be the women. It tends to be white guys in suits who will feel free to, call me scumbag and tell me to get a life or, flip me off, all those kinds of things. And when I kind of do that demographic breakdown of who's insulting to me and who's warm and welcoming and comes up and takes a flyer and, says, have a nice day, I notice that it's the people who are most invested in the status quo, meaning the white guys in the nice suits, who are the most averse to this information. I guess you could say that they have the most to lose in a way if things get really shaken up in the way that they need to get shaken up.
Right, and I've learned to recognize that. I look at them as victims as well. Now, that's interesting what you're talking about, because, what about discrimination? And this is an important topic, because the politically correct position is that it's wrong to discriminate based on race, gender, and religion, and most people won't do that, at least openly. And it's not because they've made a personal stance against doing that at some point, but basically because they were taught in schools and on TV that it's considered wrong to do that now, and they won't be socially acceptable if they are, and that's the right position to have, don't get me wrong. However, that same establishment that's telling people not to discriminate against other groups is attacking folks who point out the scientific evidence about the controlled demolition of the buildings in New York on 9/11 and other aspects of the 9/11 lie. How does a person who doesn't want to hide their views when they come up deal with this hypocrisy and deal with this naive culture that not only allows prejudice against them on this topic, but also encourages it?
Well, I tend to be kind of an outlier in my positions. For instance, I'm an atheist. For instance, I do not buy into the psychiatric establishment with its diagnoses and its drugs and whatnot. So I'm kind of used to being on the periphery of the conventional wisdom. In fact, I usually think of the term conventional wisdom as an oxymoron. If it's conventional, it's not wisdom. It's not individuals thinking for themselves and soberly examining the evidence to come to a rational conclusion. I wanted to address the issue of racism because I think that's a huge, huge part of this. In fact, well, let me backtrack a little bit. I'm of the opinion that all of us are racist. There are some of us who are covertly racist, and there's those of us who are overtly racist. And this goes for every single person, black, white, brown, any other shade in between, because we're in a culture that is saturated with it. We grow up in it. We're like sponges when we're small. We don't have the ability when we're very small children to discern which information to allow in and which information to keep out. So we are forced to absorb every ism in society: racism, sexism, classism, oppression towards Jewish people, oppression towards disabled people, and so on and so on. We can't help it. We are forced to absorb these oppressions in either the regular version where I might have racist feelings towards people who aren't white, or the internalized version where I have internalized messages that I am less than men because I'm female. So we've all got it. It's a matter of, do we feel comfortable expressing it out loud and being oppressive to others, or have we learned to sort of keep it under wraps and try not to think in that direction? But in terms of 9/11, I feel like this was set up way before it ever even happened. The government, not just our government, I think you have to throw the Israeli government in here as well, and possibly quite a few other Western governments, have been nurturing racism towards Arabs, Muslims, people of Middle Eastern descent for 30, 40 years. To be afraid, be very afraid, kind of thing, to where we were primed. All of us were already primed for 9/11. The racism towards those people, towards Middle Easterners and so on, was already there for white Americans. The government knew it. The government could take that to the bank. And so when 9/11 happens and the government says this is who did it, within minutes of the planes flying into the towers, we've already got that racism in there, for many of us, just sort of lying there latent, and all it needed was that trigger, and there it is.
You're right, and that's interesting. I've never really thought of it from that angle before, but it's an internalized racism that was played on, because I think a lot, because I saw this after the event, the week afterwards. They had all the cartoons where they were making fun of Arabs. It reminds you of almost like the old Sambo cartoons from the early 20th century when they're making fun of black people, but it became acceptable that week. Americans had a free rein to be racist against the Middle Easterners. Now, and George Bush did give lip service to saying, don't blame all Middle Eastern people, because that's what he's expected to say. But at the same time, they're pushing this, and they're also pushing this discrimination against people like us, where it's okay to attack them, where it's okay for a newspaper to call them names, whereas they wouldn't have the guts to do that for black people now, or for people who follow a certain religion. It's okay to talk about somebody who's pointing out the scientific evidence of the controlled demolitions of the towers as a nut job, and to call them names within a newspaper article. And it's funny, how do people deal with that, and again prevent from becoming resentful and mentally isolated?
Well, once again, you have to be part of an organization. If you don't have an organization where you live, then by all means start one and keep in contact with the online organizations, so that at least you have that sort of intellectual camaraderie every day. But boy, getting together with other people and having potlucks and planning events and going on marches together and all that kind of stuff, that's what's going to save you, because you're right. This is I think a lot about oppression and discrimination. Right now we have a gay rights movement in this country that sort of languished for years and finally started to pick up steam, and all of a sudden, one by one, the states are falling into line and approving marriage equality. It took a long, long time for that to happen, and all of a sudden, it's gay people are considered to be almost a protected class like African Americans, where it's no longer considered okay to slander them out loud. But if you're atheist or if you're a 9/11 truth activist, you are not in a protected class yet. You are it's considered to, or if you're very overweight, there would be another one. It's considered still okay to attack you, with impunity, and it's a sad commentary. It feels like sometimes like we're a society that lacks manners, and yet most of the time when I'm out in public doing my 9/11 truth activism, most of the time people are not outright nasty to me. You remember the people who are, but they actually turn out to be a very small minority.
Now, something I wanted to touch on before the show ends today is raising kids. Now, I don't have any kids, folks, but how do you handle this topic with your kids? I mean, should you talk about this with them? Because it's going to come up, and in school they're going to learn about 9/11 and about how Muslim boogeymen attacked us because they hate us because we're free. Is it appropriate to talk about this with your kids? If so, at what age? How do you discuss this with them if it comes up?
I may not be the best example here. I tend to not do things halfway. And so when I became a 9/11 truth activist, I really went for it. And so many of our dinner conversations with my daughter and my son and my husband were about 9/11, to the point where my poor daughter just was starting to say, "I'm tired of this. We got to start talking about something else." So, if you can keep it down to a reasonable level, I would certainly. I think she sort of felt like she was a 9/11 orphan after a while because we talked about it so much. My son, on the other hand, got really into it, and he and my daughter both went to an alternative high school where they had to do a lot of sort of self-researched projects, and so he threw himself into the 9/11 research and made a video compilation and wrote a research paper about it and so on, and he's spending years now arguing with people in online forums about the 9/11 truth evidence. And so for him, I think it was a very positive thing. For my daughter, maybe a little less so. She got a little less attention than she might otherwise have, but she's turned into a pretty good activist on other things in her own right, and so I guess probably better to overdo it on the 9/11 activism end than to not talk about it at all, I guess.
Right, and again, I don't have kids. I've thought about this, though, how I would strategize this, and it's a fine line because you don't want to scare kids. I don't want to. If I ever have kids, I'd like them to have their childhood and be able to be as carefree as possible growing up, but I also want them to be smart. I don't want them following this government and this establishment off of a cliff. So it is difficult, and I stress this. I would stress this with not just kids, but any activists listening out there. You talked about that period where you worried, oh my God, are they going to come after me? And it's funny, I never ever really feel like that. I don't really. Maybe I'm like Abraham Lincoln being lax on the security. I don't know, but I don't really ever get that feeling like anyone's going to really ever come after me because I think there's too many of us, and I don't really think I'm all that big. The people who have to worry is if you got some kind of new information that's damning. That's when you got to start worrying about that stuff. But right now, they feel free just to marginalize us, to make fun of us, and I think the system is pretty content with that pace. So it is a fine line, and it's something that people do need to think about. But I think they need to start talking to teachers if it comes up. If there's like a report that needs to be done on 9/11, and be like, look, I'm not going to write a letter to the teacher or go in and talk to him and say, look, I'm not going to have my kid spouting lies. We don't. This is what I'm teaching my kid because this is the truth. I'll give you a DVD if you want, but please exclude my kid from this project. I think that would be a good method for handling a situation like that, and just being very honest with them and saying, look, it's a different. This is the situation in the world, but don't be afraid of it. Just be empowered and know what's really going on.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you bring this up about school because you mentioned, you read my bio that said that I was formerly a science teacher. I was also trained as a social studies teacher. Never actually taught it, taught science instead. But social studies, yeah, it's if we could figure out how to get to all the social studies teachers in this country and really kind of educate them on that, boy, that would be a wonderful, wonderful thing. And I think we're almost 12 years on now since 9/11 happened, and the potency of the incident is decreasing with each year. But the importance of 9/11 remains, and it's growing in a certain sense because it's now part of what we're looking at as state crimes against democracy, which is a fairly new term that was coined by a social scientist named Lance D. Haven Smith, who's written a book called Conspiracy Theory in America. And if we can really start embedding 9/11 within a context of these state crimes, the assassinations of presidents and whatnot, it gives social studies teachers, among others, something meatier to look at, and it's less shocking to look at 9/11 within a context rather than as an isolated event.
Right, but the problem is that they have to follow a certain curriculum, and I read a story on the news, in the news portion of the show, many episodes back, about a test that was given in some school, and parents were up in arms because the right answer for the question was something like, why did 9/11 happen, or why, something like that, and it said something like, because Americans, and basically I forgot the exact name or the exact answer, but it insinuated blowback for things that we had done in other countries, that it was people mad about things that we had done around the world. And very neutral, but that was the essence of it. And people were in outrage. It was on Fox News, and they made a big deal. I think teachers would be afraid of going out of their safe bubble of what's approved by the curriculum. It's like you have to get to the Board of Regents or something in a particular state in order to get any inroads with that.
Well, and some states are going to be a lot worse than others, and some, my kids went to an alternative school where teachers could do, that they had huge latitude. However, at my kids' school, there one year, this is Colorado, some law came down that mandated the reciting of the Pledge of Allegiance each morning. And as soon as we found this out, I called my children's teachers at the school, and I said, my children are not to participate in this. I don't believe in forced acts of patriotism. I think any kind of patriotism needs to come from the heart, or it's worthless. Otherwise, it's just sort of some sort of brainwashing exercise. And then I called the ACLU and the school district, the school board, and spent most of the day on the phone. And enough other parents were doing the same thing to where this got overturned, and some sort of injunction happened, and that the ACLU, I believe, pushed through. And so forced recitation of the Pledge of Allegiance, didn't happen in Colorado. So a lot of this, yeah, you're right. Teachers can be in a bind, although they have more latitude a lot of times than they claim they do, I believe. But parents really can take up this fight on behalf of teachers and on behalf of children everywhere, and not allow this kind of bogus education to happen.
Now, I got a question, as a counselor, what would be your advice on this? Let's say that a 9/11 Truth activist has a problem. Maybe he or she is an alcoholic, or they got aggression issues or depression, whatever. And while the controlled demolition of the buildings in New York and this big mass cover-up may not be the core underlying cause of these issues for this person, it certainly will factor in for them right now in what they're dealing with. So if you're one of these people, how do you approach a therapist who isn't aware of the controlled demolition evidence and include this in the list of issues you're dealing with now without your therapist, writing you off as suffering from paranoid delusions? How do you make them realize that the evidence is real and something that is a legitimate factor in your current situation?
Oh boy, that is a tough one, because with this current mania for diagnosing and prescribing medication that, of course, is going to make any problem worse. They're all brain-disabling medications. People are in a tough spot. They're very isolated. My first thought is to watch the video, the DVD put out by Richard Gage and his colleagues from a 9/11 Truth, and the video 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out. I'm on that, and quite a few of my colleagues are too, my counseling, psychological colleagues. Try to contact one of them if you really, maybe one of them would be willing to counsel you by phone. I believe, I'm not positive about this, I think there may be also some sort of psychotherapist for 9/11 Truth organization that may be able to refer you. Get what support you can. Don't necessarily, if you can't line up a 9/11 Truth-oriented psychotherapist, then form a support group. Support groups can often be better than individual therapy anyway for all kinds of situations. But form a support group and give everybody equal time. Use a timer. Give everybody equal time to talk. That'll help bring down your sense of urgency and isolation around 9/11, and then maybe you can go to a conventional therapist if you must to get help for your other issues.
Yeah, and it's funny. I look at this and I see that there's a void in this particular topic, and no doubt realizing this has a tremendous psychological impact on people. I mean, it's one of the reasons that people avoid it, because they don't want to know this. They don't want to mess with their worldview. And I haven't seen any, and maybe I'm wrong. Hopefully somebody will correct me, but I don't see any kind of groups. You mentioned psychologists for 9/11 Truth. I'll look into that. But if somebody's looking to create something, or at least some kind of web page giving advice on these kinds of things, then they need to step up and do it. I've even considered having people write up something for my website as a little offshoot. But this is definitely a void that needs to be filled. Now, in our last few minutes, I wanted to touch on this too: relationships, dealing with a spouse or a girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever. The person may be opposed. Maybe you were married before 9/11 and they're opposed to your truth views, or maybe they are aware of the evidence but they're not as passionate as you in exposing it. How do you reconcile that in a relationship?
Oh, I can only speak for myself. Everybody needs to come to her or his own assessment of how important this issue is. For me, it would be a deal breaker to not have the person on board at least intellectually. I would not need my partner to be on board in terms of activism, but if the intellectual part weren't there, I don't think I could make it work. It's too big a bridge to cross. Otherwise, it would be the elephant in the room that you can't talk about. And it's a pretty big elephant because it determines so much of our entire worldview of why, of causation and effect, of what makes things happen, what makes the world tick. And if you can't be somewhere, if you can't have some degree of consensus around that, to me it wouldn't be worth it.
It's amazing, and that's why people need to talk with each other. They need to find each other and form the groups that will back each other up. And we're going to talk more about this topic on this show every so often because, again, I think it's one that you can't talk about enough. You can talk about the science till you're blue in the face, but if people are not willing to accept it, then it will go nowhere. And at the same time, if you're out there and you're speaking the truth, but you're constantly running up against a wall, that will have an effect on you as well. So it's something that needs to be explored, discussed, and dealt with and treated on a massive scale for activists so that people are more comfortable and happier in fighting this fight. Do you have any final thoughts, Dorothy?
Yes, I do. I want everybody to remember that as difficult as incorporating and integrating the 9/11 truth information is, there's a payoff. It gives us hope for the future that we finally have the key to unlocking the mystery of why wars start, why governments go to war, how governments get their people to go to war. And I have hope for myself, for my children and their children's future, that at some point down the road, I don't know when it's going to be, that we will stop this madness, this insanity, and we will have that peaceful and just world that we all dream of.
Well, thank you, Dorothy, and for those thoughts. Folks, we are out of time. Remember, you can listen to this program every week on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. This is Andy Steele saying good luck and have a great week.
11 years after 9/11, experts are speaking out about what really destroyed the Twin Towers and Building 7.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
It's controlled demolition. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the document from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
Go to 911expertspeakout.org.